Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. Just have a few announcements, and then we'll get started for this evening's program. The first announcement has to do with our next program, which will be here at the church on August 14th. The title of it is Successes and Challenges with Native Plants. This is an interactive program. We need your input to make it successful. We sent out an email on July 7th with a link to fill out a form. It asks you specific questions about successes and challenges that you've had with native plants. And then what we'll do during the meeting is we'll have a PowerPoint presentation describing these, and then we'll have discussion. You can ask anything. You can ask, I can't grow wild catchfly. Does anybody know what's going on? Or you can say, hey, I'm trying to design this area that's part shade and it's on a hill, to help me out. And I think it's going to be a great opportunity for all of us to learn from each other. The deadline to fill out that form is July 15th. So I believe that's this Friday. So if you haven't done it yet, please go out. Kathy and Diane have spent a lot of time developing that form, and it's really easy to use. You don't have to come up with a grand plan on your own. Just answer their questions. Second, if you belong to the pollinator pathway and you don't have a pollinator pathway sign and you'd like one, I have some with me. If you're a member, there's no charge for this sign. If you're not a member, it's $8. Next thing, our program tonight will be live streamed as soon as that's available. There's a link that was also sent out in the email on July 7th. Next, we're going to put Nature Trails Day is September 16th at Kamlara Park. It's from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. We need a few volunteers to staff our booth. If you're interested, let me know tonight, or we will send out a sign-up genius, so look for that. We have a pretty large quantity of poke milkweed that Janet Rasmussen grew. And there's also some common milkweed back here that we're giving away this evening. So if you would like some, please, it's in the back. Please let us know. If everybody wants their start, if you want 2 or 3, that's fine. If everybody gets 2 or 3 and there's more left over, you're welcome to take more. And then finally, on August 1st, we're sending out an email to everyone with an annual call for volunteers. There's many opportunities with our organization to help, whether you want to be a committee chairperson or if you just want to help maybe write a recap of a program for the newsletter. We'll send out that email, and if you could reply and let us know, we'll contact you for more information. And then finally, we have a field trip this Saturday on July 16th. Doug McCarty will be one of the leaders, and I think he's going to tell us more about that.
Yeah, actually, I've got 2 announcements to talk about. I'm sorry. Okay. What? All right. Actually, I've got 2 different field trips that you might be interested in. The first one is next Saturday, and that's the Friends Creek Conservation Area. It's a marvelous new park that it's a county-run park, but they've done quite a bit of work on, yes, Sunday. Did I say Saturday? Oh, darn. Okay, this one is Sunday, okay? And the county has done a marvelous job with this little park. And it has 3 different trails through it. You're going to see a wide variety of plants, both in the prairie area, and I was amazed at the diversity of their woodland areas. It's really kind of special, and it's easy trails. We'll be there for 2-3 hours at least, I would think, and it's coming up Sunday. We can meet here and carpool. That might be the simplest way. Let's try to get here by 9, and we've got several people going that have space in their cars, including mine. So I invite you all this coming Sunday. Now, in addition to that one, there's another thing coming up this Saturday, and that is going on at Jubilee State Park. And the Jubilee Prairie Dogs have been working on the prairies out there for over 20 years. And it is the most diverse and lovely area that you can see. And so it's an open house. There are refreshments out there. It's lots going on. I think it starts at 9 o'clock Saturday, July 15th. And so 9 o'clock Saturday at Jubilee State Park, 9 o'clock Sunday at Friends Creek Conservation Area in Macon County. So I hope to see some of you there. You will enjoy it, both of them. Thank you. Okay. Yes, I think for the Friends Creek, contact Sandy. Sandy?
By July 13th.
By
July 13th.
Okay, good. All right.
Sandra,
The
that went out July 7th. Yeah.
Okay, great. As far as Jubilee Park, that's open to the public, and no need to sign up. Just show up, and you will enjoy it. So, thank you all.
I'll turn it over to Kathy, and she'll introduce our speaker.
So thank you for coming tonight. We're in for a good program. We're pleased to have Sarah Livesay with us tonight. She's a Central Illinois native. She graduated from Eastern Illinois University, and she pursued a career in field biology and environmental education. For the past 20 years, her focus has been the development of capacity building of conservation nonprofit entities. She's provided services to state, national, and international nonprofits. Some of those are the Environmental Education Association of Illinois, the National Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and Japan Parks and Recreation, among others. In 2017, she was hired as the first executive director of Grand Prairie Friends. And since 1984, Grand Prairie Friends has served as a conservation land trust. It preserves, protects, and restores over 1,200 acres of natural areas across East Central Illinois. The beginning of Grand Prairie Friends is kind of interesting, or I found it interesting. It began with 6 volunteers banding together to save a 6-acre prairie remnant in Champaign County. So I think that just goes to show that those small efforts can turn into big things. We want to fast forward almost 40 years now. This organization now preserves, protects, and promotes, as I said, 1,200 acres of natural spaces across 130 miles of East Central Illinois. She has a visual field trip for us today. We'll be seeing a sand prairie pond in East Central Illinois. She'll tell us about some cemetery prairies and even tell us about a Coles County area dedicated to endangered bats. So I hope this will give you the impetus to go out and explore, and I'm looking forward to it. We will have questions at the end, and we'll bring a microphone around so that everyone can hear, and especially since we're recording tonight, so that we can hear if you have questions. So welcome, Sarah. We're glad to have you.
Okay, can everyone hear on this microphone? Is that working? Okay, great. So welcome. My name is Sarah Livesay, as I was so warmly introduced. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be with your group. I see some known faces in the audience, so but many not known faces. And that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that this information is new to you, or Grand Prairie Friends is new to you. And as I always say at the end of the night, if you can leave with at least one new $5 word, some new vocab word that you can throw out there at the dinner table and wow all of your dinner guests. That's what I'm hoping for tonight. So with that, Grand Prairie Friends, as it was mentioned, our mission is to preserve, protect, and restore natural resources across East Central Illinois. And also, as was named, we are almost approaching our 40th birthday. And this is a great celebration for us in that we have been able to successfully do all three of these things. And why the three-tiered mission? That's really important to us. We, as a land trust, we're going to talk about what that means to be a land trust. It's somewhat of an interesting kind of animal. But as a land trust, we are able to buy and purchase lands. We have to put a preservation or an easement on that land to protect it in perpetuity, because as much as I would like to believe I won't be here forever, none of us will. So we have to make sure that for the future, forever, that property is protected. And then to further seal that deal, we have to promote and create that next generation of stewards. We have to educate, and we have to engage them and get them to love this land just like we do. Because again, we won't be here forever, and we need someone to take that next step. So our story is very heartwarming, I think. 1984, as she mentioned, this group of people came together because the short line prairie, which we named it, it was not named prior, but it was a prairie that had remained right in the middle of two agricultural fields. Very common that these tall grass prairie remnants remain along railroad right-of-ways. And what other place? Cemeteries, absolutely. So those places where the plow didn't reach, and they were saved. Those the seed beds were left intact, and those plants and animals and those communities were left intact. And so for that reason, Shortline Prairie became this space that these people wanted to protect. And so they got together, they formed a nonprofit, they called themselves the Grand Prairie Friends, but maybe not for the reason you would think. Somebody tell me what you think of when you hear the word Grand Prairie. Is there something beyond just the plants and animals themselves? Maybe the division of land you live in? Does anyone know about the Grand Prairie Division? Has anyone heard that before? I see some nodded heads. You live in the Grand Prairie Division. The state of Illinois is actually broken into living divisions. And where you live, from this Bloomington Normal area over east, if you can imagine the state, over east to the border of Indiana, up to about Kankakee, all the way south to about Douglas, just south of Champaign County. That stretch of Illinois is called the Grand Prairie Division. And the reason is because it was covered in tallgrass prairie. And we're just not talking tallgrass prairie. We're talking about tallgrass prairie where a man on horseback could not see over the grass. We're talking about tallgrass prairie in which a man on horseback going from Bloomington to the state line of Indiana often took him 2 horses to get there, because one would certainly die trying to get through the wet, muddy tallgrass prairie. And the insects were so thick, if he didn't die because he got stuck in the prairie, he would die from the insects. So we have these amazing journals from our early pioneers that were coming through this area, telling us these stories of the Grand Prairie Division. At that time, most of these journals date back to the early 1800s. Many of them talk about the impact of the prairie, but they also talk about the extent of the prairie and how you couldn't see beyond the prairie. 88% of the ground cover at that time was tall grass prairie. So I brought prizes tonight. Tell me what percentage of prairie is remaining in the Grand Prairie Division right now. We were 88%. What do you think? Yes, you're very close. 1/100th of 1%. 1/100th of 1%. That is what we have remaining in tallgrass prairie. So when our friends got together in 1984, they wanted to save this prairie. But the name Grand Prairie Friends wasn't about what they were going to save. It was about where they started. They started in the Grand Prairie Division. The goal wasn't just to save prairie. The goal was to save our native ecosystems. And that is what I'm about to tell you, the journey of how we've accomplished that. So from 1984 to 2013, this organization was completely volunteer-based, completely volunteer-led. They wrote the grants, they pulled the garlic mustard, they bought the land, they did it all. And in that time, they assembled about 60 acres, raising funds, car washes, all of the above, and some grant writing to get to these 60 acres. And in that time, it was Champaign, Ford, Iroquois counties. So they focused and stayed very focused on their initial region. And because they were in the Grand Prairie Division, most of those were remnant prairies that were still remaining. Something was about to change. Soon, they went from an organization for the first 30 years or 20-some years holding 60 acres to this today. Today, as was mentioned, 130 miles from north to south and almost 1,200 acres of land protected in perpetuity, owned by the organization. So what I want to share with you is that fun journey of how this happened. Before I do that, I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what is a land trust. A land trust is a really interesting organization. I have worked in federal government, state government, and then county conservation groups. And I can tell you that while all of them have benefits, certainly, there was a lot of red tape. If any of you have worked for a university or a governmental entity, you know, even requesting a book or requesting leave or requesting a professional development experience can lead to a lot of paperwork, a lot of waiting, and not a lot of getting things done very quickly. Land trusts, I believe, are the animal in which we can get conservation done much faster. We are a nonprofit organization. As I said earlier, we were volunteer-led, volunteer origin. We are not a taxing body. Like I said, completely nonprofit. Definitely pluses and minuses there. No tax income coming in, like when we were with the government agencies. But I will tell you that there is also so much involvement by the membership and those donors that do this good work. There are ideas, there is research and science, and then it happens. So you have the funding, you have the persons, you have the passion, you make the work happen. It happens very fast. And sometimes it happens in 3 days. We're going to talk about some of our stories that have truly made land conservation and preservation happen in 3 days' time. I guarantee you that would not happen at any of the government entities I worked at prior. We also have the benefit as a membership-based organization to listen to our members and our donors and follow through with good conservation work. When I worked at the Forest Preserve, we are a taxing body and we have constituents. When I am at the Park District, I had constituents to listen to. And a lot of times They all have many different ideas of where we should go with this. And it wasn't usually conservation first. It was usually recreation. There were a host of different interests. So at a land trust, what we can focus on is conservation first, and then what we call passive human amenity second. So those are things that we know, like I said earlier, we need to promote, we need to get that next generation involved. We need to get people and volunteers inspired and engaged in this work, but not at the detriment of the natural resources, not at the detriment of conservation. So when you're thinking of developing trails and you're thinking of those other recreational activities, those will be second to protecting the resource. So those are some of the bonuses of being in a land trust. There are different types of land trusts. There are land trusts that don't own any land, and they hold easement over other high priority conservation lands that someone else owns, and they act as a protector of those spaces. There are other land trusts like Grand Prairie Friends. We are called a fee simple land trust. Our board of directors has decided for over 40 years now to only own our own land. We will not protect or hold easement on someone else's land. So there's lots of different ways to do this and a lot of different thought processes with land trusts. Sometimes it is because a specific species triggers the protection. Sometimes, like the beautiful lady slippers in the middle or the Michigan lilies here, sometimes those are the triggers themselves. We need to protect this ecosystem because of this triggering event, this site, this river, this plant that needs protected. Other times, it is a conservation value in the land itself, not necessarily what resides there currently, but maybe it is a very important stretch of the Embra River, or maybe it is a connecting tool where we see potential because here is a high natural area, here is a high natural area, and if we buy the piece in the middle, that's connecting this conservation corridor. So maybe it's the potential of what could be there that makes it so valuable for conservation. All kinds of exciting ways to look at this. One of the tools in our land trust toolbox is working with the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission. Has anyone heard of the Nature Preserves Commission? I bet many of you have visited sites that have the word nature preserve at the end. Yes? How many of you can think about visiting a site where at the end it said land and water reserve? Has anyone heard that one? A couple of you? Great. Those are tools in the toolbox. The Illinois Nature Preserve Commission is somewhat of an arm of the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And this, for Grand Prairie Friends, we own the land, but is that enough? What if something happens to our organization? What happens when our donors and members who invest and donate and help us purchase land want a little more assurance that we're doing the right thing? That's where the Nature Preserve Commission comes in. They come in, they evaluate the land, and they find out what is the conservation value of this land. And when it is present, like I said, it could be a plant, it could be the landscape itself, they will offer their own protection on that land, an easement of sorts. And they will say, this is good enough to be dedicated permanently as a nature preserve. Or they could offer a land and water reserve. And in that case, that seals that space. So if anything should happen, they are there to pick up the pieces and take care of that. But it also is a protector for donors and members to know that this and Grand Prairie Friends and this space are all being watched. We have land management schedules we have to follow. We have annual monitoring. They come and check up on us. So it's this double, triple protection assurance. for everyone involved that the right, most solid conservation is happening on this land. About 80% of Grand Prairie Friends properties are protected in the Nature Preserves Commission. Yes? Depends on the acquisition. And that's an excellent question. Her question was, are mineral rights part of that? And that depends on every acquisition. So we have title search, what's called title search. You've had it whenever you've bought a property or a house as well. And that's something we have to look at with a magnifying glass, with a fine-tooth comb. And that is different in every acquisition. It's a really good question. So I'm going to take you on a short journey here, and I won't get to spend time on every preserve with you, but I want to give you this tunnel view of how we went from 5 really anxious and excited volunteers to now 1,200 acres across 130 miles. So in 1984, I've already told you the story of Shortline Prairie and how our group sat down at a kitchen table and they decided to pull this organization together and save the Shortline Prairie. But then the next was Bonnie's Prairie. In about 92, Bonnie's Prairie is up by Watsika, just south of the Kankakee area. This, still today, is the only sand pond prairie in this entire section of Illinois. The reason this is so important is a little creature we're going to talk about in just a minute. Fairchild Cemetery Prairie was the first cemetery that Grand Prairie Friends took ownership of. And you've already told me the reason why cemeteries and prairies go hand in hand. So this does not surprise you, I'm sure. This is Bonnie's Prairie, as I said, up near Watsika, our furthest north property. And this shows it in 2 different seasons. You'll see, obviously, there's some ephemeral qualities to a sand pond prairie. And it is just what you would assume. It is left behind by glacial activity and just a very unique ecosystem. This little guy in the middle is a bee in the family of the pickerel bees. Now, those of you know the plant. Is there a plant similar to the pickerel? What would that be? Anyone know any of their pickerel plants? Yes, pickerel weed. And so this pickerel bee only enjoys pickerel weed, but not just any pickerel weed, the very specific that is only found in sand pond prairies. So to this date, in early 90s, this bee had only been found in 1 other site in the entire state of Illinois until they found it in Bonnie's Prairie. Suddenly, Bonnie's Prairie, named after Bonnie, she decided this needed a permanent home to protect the bee, to protect the plants, to protect this very sensitive ecosystem. And she donated it to Grand Prairie Friends. Fairchild Cemetery, over in Vermilion County near Danville, Illinois, is also a very special little site. As I said, it was one of the first cemetery. It's actually a savanna. So for those of you familiar with that ecosystem, you're going to see a mix of prairie and trees. You're going to see a very lovely savanna area, very common on the outskirts of our tallgrass prairie communities. This has a very fun little creature called the silvery salamander, only found throughout Vermilion County and right across the border in Vermilion County, Indiana as well. This salamander is one of the mole salamander family members, and it is the only one known to science to reproduce asexually. It is an entire female population, just females. So every spring, a smallmouth salamander, the males will come and they will go to the eggs of the silvery salamander, and that will stimulate those eggs, but no genetic material is shared. Very interesting little creature. So again, an interesting reason to protect Fairchild Cemetery. As we move on down this timeline, we're looking at some of the other spaces. Again, Loda Cemetery Prairie, one of the most well-known cemeteries and well-studied prairies in the Midwest. We'll definitely talk about that. And then James Nance Woods. We suddenly went all the way south to Neoga, Illinois, down by Shelby County. And we'll talk about that story as well. Then you're going to start to see sneaking in this word warbler. Warbler becomes its own macro site, and we're going to talk about that as well. So Loda, how many of you have visited Loda? Anyone been to Loda before? Good. It is a gem, certainly. Grand Prairie Friends first purchased Loda, and then we were lucky enough, it was a transfer from the Nature Conservancy, and then we were lucky enough to raise funds to buy a buffer around Loda to protect that critically endangered remnant meaning original prairie, in the middle. One of the exciting, I'm giving you the little sneak behind tonight, one of the exciting secrets of Loda Prairie is this, the eastern prairie fringed orchid. Now, the eastern prairie fringed orchid is an endangered species, as many of you have known, and maybe you've been lucky enough to encounter them in one of your visits to either this prairie or another. But the problem is that they are critically endangered and they are very isolated. We see that in conservation over and over as this loss of habitat, but also this loss, this isolation. That's what we're seeing with the collapse of some of these species and these populations. So we get to work. So every year, right around the 4th of July, we hover, our staff hovers, our volunteers hover around the spaces where the eastern prairie fringed orchid usually pops up. Last 2 years ago, we had 11 individuals come up. Last year, we had 4. This year, we had none. But there is hope. We've had year of none before. This species, actually, even if there is reproduction, it takes up to 7 years under the ground before we see them above the ground. So there is hope. There is faith, right? So this was last year. And the individuals, as soon as they come up and as soon as they're going to flower, as I said, we hover and we hold our breath and we wait. And then when we think it's time that the flowers are going to open, we call to Chicago, to one of the prairies just north of Nachusa, because they also have a population of eastern prairie fringed orchid, and that's the closest. So we say, it's time. So they go out, they collect pollen from theirs, they put them in the FedEx box, they overnight it to us. We get up in the morning. As you can see, Ashley, my intern, takes her toothpick, takes her goggles, and she hand pollinates these in the Loda Cemetery Prairie. Why would we do that? Why would we do that? Genetics. We don't want these 4 or these 11 to share those genetics. It would be a collapse, right, of this community. And so we do the same. We do collect from our own orchids and we ship it back up. And because they have a very small population as well. And so this is what saving a species looks like. And this is just one of those conservation triggers of why Loda is so important. We have, on an annual basis, we have an entire volunteer position called research coordinator. Their job, his name is Eric, Eric's job is just to field all the incoming research permit requests from all the universities across the United States to come and spend time at Loda and or Prospect, 2 of our most high quality prairies. We have a researcher from University of Wisconsin last week and from Harvard University this week because they want this data. This is where they can fly, they can get the research they need, but these spaces aren't around anymore. So to get this remnant information, they have to come all that way. So also as a research opportunity, these spaces are so vital. This is from the overlook at Loda. We built this in that protective buffer, obviously not in the remnant. But if you do take a road trip to Loda, take a lunch and enjoy the overlook. So this is Nance Woods. And I show you this story because it is actually our furthest south site, as I mentioned, in Shelby County, down by Neoga, Illinois. Not anything protected or threatened or endangered that we've encountered on this 20-acre woodlot. But it is another story, another layer of why land trusts are so important. And that is family heritage and family legacy. So many families have for decades and decades protected this farm or this woodlot or this prairie, and they don't want to see that be destroyed. And so ultimately, they come to a decision in their family, whether that's because the children aren't interested in carrying on this work, or they just have decided it's time to protect this forever, that they reach out to a land trust and ask and or donate these spaces. And Jim Nance Woods is the perfect example of that. Mr. Nance reached out to us, wanted to preserve this forever, and we obliged. So one thing you have to think about, though, as a land trust, well, it'd be hard to say no, right? Someone wants to give you their land, and wow, that's fantastic. And in the early days, there was probably more yeses than nos. But now we know there have to be more nos than yeses. And that's because if we are committed to our mission of being good stewards, we have to promise that not only are we taking these properties and putting a fence around them and locking the key, that doesn't protect anything. That's not conservation. Conservation is when you steward that land and you remove the invasives and you plant new trees and you use toothpicks to pollinate endangered species. That is being good stewards. Unfortunately, as a nonprofit, we have a staff of 3 across 130 miles to do all this good work. And we depend on people like you, stewards, to come and volunteer your time to do this good work. And so when we are approached with a property, even if it is a donation, we have to run what is called a stewardship calculator. The stewardship calculator uses imagination, magic, and a little bit of science to try and determine what it will cost forever to steward this property, to do right by this property. So we have to think about our resources and being good stewards. But Jim Nance Woods is definitely one of those sites. We're going to talk about Edna Burnett a little as we move further in the future for Grand Prairie Friends. And then, like I said, all those warblers keep popping up. We're going to talk about those as well. Before I dive into Miss Edna Burnett, I'm going to tell you a story about Prospect Prairie. Some of you said you visited Prospect Prairie. It is also one of the original remnant prairies, a cemetery prairie. And Grand Prairie Friends, I know I told you earlier that we own all of our own land, but there's lots of gray areas, right? When you have to do the right thing to be a steward of the earth too. Prospect Prairie has been owned by the township, Patton Township, near Paxton, Illinois, forever. But for the last 25 years, they haven't had the resources or the education or the background to have someone come in and really take care of these spaces. And so the township asked Grand Prairie Friends, could you help us? And of course, we said we would be happy to. And our volunteers have loved on the site. Our staff have loved on the site. And so we have just, for the good of the good, taken care of this site without resources or reimbursement, just done the right thing. But we started getting very nervous in the past few years because, as you all know, elected officials change, rules change, and we started to see some of that. And we thought, what if in a couple of years they say, you know what, we don't really want you on our property anymore. You know what, it might be a liability risk. You know what, we really don't want you burning this prairie, which is not ours. What if, right? That's a scary thought when we think of such a critically endangered remnant prairie. So we started appealing to both our membership, to the township, and finally, we got a little break in the ice, and we were able to raise enough money that the township would listen. And we finally, after 25 years, just celebrated about 18 months ago of finally buying and owning Prospect Prairie. So even though Prospect is a small 6 to 8 acre parcel, it was a really huge conservation accomplishment for us. So this is us cutting the grapevine at the grand opening just last year. But on to Edna. Edna is just south of Champaign, the Tolono-Pasodum area, if you're familiar with that. So the far Champaign County region. And Edna Burnett is another story of family legacy. Mr. Ralph Burnett wanted to leave the 20 acres on the Embra River to Grand Prairie Friends. So back in 2005, Grand Prairie Friends took on this parcel of the Burnett property. But right next to the 20 acres was another 60 acres in row crop agriculture. Towards the end of his life, Mr. Burnett reached out to Grand Prairie Friends and said, I want to expand Edna. He called it Edna after his mother. He said, I want to expand Edna, but he was late in his life and he did pass. His sons quickly stepped in and said, we want to finish Dad's dream, but it's wrapped up in this estate and the trust and all of those things. So Grand Prairie Friends went back to our grantors. We worked with Illinois Clean Energy and an unlikely but new interesting partner to save and purchase that additional 60 acres next to Burnett. So Burnett is now 80 acres. These little guys in the corner down here, those are the tri-colored bats. And in an interesting turn, they became our partners in buying this property. So the tri-colored bat is one that's about to be listed on the endangered species list for Illinois and likely federally. And in an agreement between U.S. Fish and Wildlife and private energy companies, whenever a wind turbine is installed, they have to apply, the energy company has to apply with U.S. Fish and Wildlife for a permit. And they have to indicate, the scientists go out and they say, we think when you install this, it's going to take this many lives of bats, this many lives of birds, whatever's in the path of that wind turbine. That's called an incidental take permit. So when that happens, the energy company has to pay at a fee for the amount of animals taken. So that money goes to the animals, period. It goes in a bank account for the bats, or the birds, or the moles, or whatever it is. But they don't sign checks well. So what ends up happening is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service find a partner, a mitigation partner. And through a process, it's called in lieu fee mitigation, Grand Prairie Friends acts as the advocate for the bat. Now, these funds are tracked like nothing else, and they should be, but it adds a layer of complexity to the work that we do in tracking this work. These funds cannot be spent on insurance or gasoline or staff costs or any of those things. They have to be for the bats. So, knowing that these are tree bats, and they love to climb up under the shaggy bark of hickory trees, we immediately got to work. You see two of our amazing people right now. And on this day and the next 5 days, they planted 22,000 oak and hickory trees. And this was in that new 60-acre property that we purchased right next to Ralph's existing property, all for the tricolored bat. But this made up the difference we needed to buy this parcel. And that became a precipitating factor of how some of our other properties were acquired. I'm going to talk to you about that. As you look now at the speed of how acquisition really got fast and furious, remember back for me, 1984 to 2013, how many acres did we have? 60. This quickly sped up. And there's a reason for that. These warbler properties that I keep mentioning, if you can see the map, Warbler Ridge is down in Charleston, Illinois. It's literally about 4-minute drive from the Eastern Illinois University campus, just south of town. And if you have visited Charleston, or if you're familiar with Charleston, you will know that Lake Charleston is a large natural area right outside of town, and that's the purple at the top. And then way down at the bottom, if you see the brown, that is Fox Ridge State Park. So the idea, remember earlier I said no one likes to live on an island, and we've seen that with our Eastern Prairie Fringed orchid, for example. So the idea in science, conservation science right now, landscape conservation design, there's that new $5 word for your dinner table tonight. Landscape conservation design, that idea that we need to find corridors for conservation. Rather than saving a 2-acre remnant prairie that is completely isolated, we need to move our resources to where we have corridors of conservation. And this was the perfect start of that plan. So I know you can't see the dates of acquisition on there, and you're not intended to, but it quickly sped up, and we're going to go through that. So from the purple lake to the brown at the very bottom, we thought perhaps a quarter century, we could maybe stitch this together. If we write enough grants and we raise enough funds and we have enough willing landowners that are ready to sell, we might be able to do this. Maybe 25 years. It happened in about 9. And I'm going to show you how that happened. So in 2011, there was no warbler. In 2012, Grand Prairie Friends got a phone call on a Wednesday. And it was someone interested had found out that an auction was going to happen that Saturday in Charleston, Illinois. Mind you, we were up in Champaign, Ford, Iroquois, saving prairie remnants, but we get this phone call. And they said there's 141 acres going for sale right between Fox Ridge and Lake Charleston. What if, here's a crazy idea, but what if Grand Prairie Friends went to the auction and bought the property? And they started a whole mega site of conservation to connect those two spaces. Well, our president at the time, I wouldn't have been surprised if they hung up, but they didn't. I think I might have hung up, but they didn't. They kept listening. And perhaps it was because the person on the other end of the line was the Lumpkin Family Foundation. And if any of you might be familiar of that family foundation, they are based out of Mattoon, Charleston, Illinois area, and they have a purpose of conservation. This family has origins with the consolidated communications industry, and their heart is in conservation. So they were calling, and they talked to our president and said, if you go to the auction, we will pay the bill. But this is a big ask, because remember what I just told you about stewardship. It's not paying the bill at the end of the auction at 3:00. This means we own this forever. And we're up in Champaign. We're in Watseka. We don't have volunteers in Charleston, Illinois. We don't even know anybody in Charleston, Illinois yet. It was a leap of faith, but it was one that worked. So 48 hours later, our board, a team of 3 board members got in the same car. They went down to Charleston. They bid. They bought it. End of the day, they went and had a barbecue sandwich after. I've heard the whole story, and I believe every single word of it. So 141 quickly turned into 333, not because we had the money to buy more, but because the land just behind, as you can see, it's adjacent, was a professor of ornithology. He studied birds at Eastern Illinois University, and he was so inspired by this leap of faith, he said, I'm going to give you my land too, that butts up to your land. So that is how that story started. Things then escalated. There were some agricultural lands. Again, this is the Embra River that snakes through here. There were some agricultural lands that flooded more than produced anything. That farmer put the land up. We wrote more grants. We bought more land. This continues through 2017 and 2018. And the opportunities were there. People wanting to get rid of hunting land that they don't use anymore, all of these. But with each opportunity came a very fast and furious campaign, grant writing, all of these things. The turn happened about right after 2015 acquisition. The board looked at each other and said, I think we need help. I think we need some staff. Remember, they were managing 60 acres, and now suddenly things started to get a little busy. So in 2017, they hired myself. They hired me as executive director. I hired the land team. We have 2 full-time land managers, and we do intern programs, and we have part-time work throughout the year as well. So by 2020, you can see we'd even stitched the bottom, the south, together from Fox Ridge State Park. Now, if you'll notice, though, we have some patchwork to do, and we are working on that continuously. The good news is where we don't own in those lines is conservation. It still is forest land. And so it's not like a mini mall or something that the animals have to cross. It's still conservation land. Is it protected? No. Do we still want to create that corridor that we protect and own and have control over? Absolutely. But our work is a marathon, not a sprint, even though it appeared as a sprint unexpectedly. And so we'll be working on that. When I showed you the timeline, I showed you how much it sped up quickly after 2015 and they hired staff. That's because of this woman. Her name is Ashley Cable. Ashley had no idea, but she changed the course of how we acquired land and the option for us to acquire land. She was a researcher at Eastern Illinois University and University of Illinois. She was doing her grad work studying the Indiana bat. The Indiana bat is one of the most endangered species of bats in Illinois and federally. It was the last night of her research, and she had come up empty. They set up what is called a mist net, M-I-S-T, just as you would assume, so that you cannot see these mist nets, and they're hoping that the bats don't see them or have an echolocation to bounce off of the mist nets. At the end of the night, Ashley did catch a bat. It was her last option, and here she pulls the bat, and not only is it a bat, it's the Indiana bat. And not only is it the Indiana bat, it's a nursing mom Indiana bat. And that would be exciting in itself, but here's the extra icing on that cake. Indiana bats, mothers, only have their pups in large maternity colonies. So if you find one mama bat, guess what? You've found a lot of mama bats. So she put a transmitter on this bat that night. They worked through the night to find where she went. She went to a very large, this hickory tree, and 134 moms came out that night. She was on what soon became Warbler Ridge Conservation Area, right outside of Fox Ridge. She didn't know how much that would impact the work that we do. So this is a little more about the Indiana bat and why we're seeing that. You've heard of white nose syndrome. You've heard of insecticide issues. And this changed the trajectory of the work we did. We soon became known as the Bat Land Trust. And that is because not only did we have this maternity colony on site, but we engaged with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife as that mitigation partner now for the Indiana bat at this site. So those funds were available to not only take care of the bats, but to buy land adjacent to where they were found. So we protect the land and we protect the resources those bats are on. It's not like the movie where if you build it, they will come. They don't believe in that. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says, you have to prove that bat's there before we're going to give you mitigation money and invest in this further. So we, besides Ashley's research, which she had already done for us, we had to have our own research team come on site and help us identify what other bats are living on this site. And we have to have proof of that. They do that through acoustic work as well as the mist netting like Ashley did. We already talked a little bit about the habitat mitigation and how that works. Some of our bat researchers that work on this project with us at Warbler Ridge will be the first to tell you that renewable energy it's essential. We have to keep doing what we're doing with wind and solar. It's getting better every day. We're getting smarter about the placements. But unfortunately, there is what we call incidental take. And as we get these things worked out, having this mitigation to offset some of this is just one of the unfortunate things that has to keep happening. This is our bat team. The amazing team of women came on site. They lived on site. Not only do they tell us the bats are there, but they have to become the welcome crew for the bats. They have to tell us what the bats would like to eat, where the bats would like their boxes placed, what is their flight pattern in the evening, what direction do they want their boxes. So they study this behavior of the bats because our job is now to make this the most robust and safe and amazing bat habitat. We can't do that without science. We have to follow the science. So we started in year 0, before we even started this project, doing these inventories with both volunteers and professional scientists, because otherwise, how would we know if it's working? How would we know? Here we are today. I stand in front of you at year 6, but how would I know it was working if I didn't know what was in year 0? So this was a very science-based initiative. Bats like water, certainly. It's the first thing they do when they come out of their habitats in the evening. So with part of those funds, we were able to recreate about 12 acres of wetlands on the site. We have artificial bat habitats because trees take time. But to this date, as I stand here, 70,000 trees have been planted at Warbler Ridge. 70,000 trees. But again, trees take time. So these artificial habitats, we use 2 kinds. One is called a rocket box, and one is called a Brandon bark structure. Scientists came up with this artificial bark that they called Brandon bark. You literally wrap telephone poles with this artificial bark. And we thought, oh, really? Is this really going to work? They're going to do this? And they did. They loved it. So I have this amazing team of bat volunteers who were trained by our scientists to do counts. And they count the exits and entries of the bats in the evening with clickers, if you're curious. We also have bat volunteers that walk with acoustic, look like alien antennas coming out, and they walk transects around our property so that we can know exactly which species of bats are calling in the evenings. And so with this, we thought the first year, our volunteers were so patient, there might be 2 bats come out, but we were hopeful and we kept the faith. And if anyone follows our Facebook, there was even a big announcement today. But again, this is hard to read, but we had very few, a handful of bats the first year. Then we went up to 198. Then we went the next year to 478 as the peak night, 502 last year. Guess what we counted last night? And if you're on our Facebook, don't cheat, don't tell. Somebody take a guess for me. I'll get the prizes out. Oh, not that high. Oh, very close. 702 last night. So 700 bats coming out of these artificial structures last night. So that is the work that Grand Prairie Friends does from a conservation bat's eye view. And the work we do on the ground with our members and donors, well, those are outreach. We do the very typical pulling of the garlic mustard, removal of the brush, all of those things. We have open houses every Saturday, the first Saturday of every month. You know you can find us at Warbler Ridge. We don't need to find a special date or time or RSVP. Just know we're there. And we invite people to learn more about the work that we do. We have people that want to sit and volunteer. I always say, if you are a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker, we need you. We need every skill set on this earth to help us in this effort. Ridge Rovers just walk our 10 miles of trails at Warbler Ridge in order to let us know what's going on those trails or help us when limbs are down and things like that. And then, of course, we have our annual native plant sale. And again, just getting more native plants out into the community. So that's a little bit about the work that we do. And I thank you for having me tonight. I will definitely field any questions that might be in the audience. And thank you for being here. So. Any questions? Yes. Oh, it's right there.
So conservation is first, but you mentioned also passive recreation.
Yes.
What kind of passive recreation do you have?
Yes.
And is it at all the sites?
Yes, trails. So we have 10 miles of trails that go between the entire property of Warbler Ridge. We also have overlooks with just seating, like at our Loda Prairie. You saw the overlook there. So those are very passive recreation. We do not allow bikes on our trails. We think that's too much of a footprint, especially since we don't have any of the paved trails or things like that. So these are going to be footpaths for the most part, just keeping kind of in line with that. One of the things we recently did as part of our diversity and inclusion effort is we did some research on inviting new communities in, but in a very non-aggressive and not recreational way, but just to enjoy nature. And what we learned was that the research tells us that people that are not accustomed, or maybe the outdoors isn't something they've done in their life, they feel most comfortable on loop trails that are half mile in distance or less. And the key is that they can always see some structure so that they don't have that fear of being lost in the woods or somewhere, at least for this first foray out. So we built one of these trails called Aspen Trail, and it just loops from our parking lot around. We have this little red shack, we call it. It loops around, and at any time you can see the roof of the little red shack. But it's still engaging and just in a very non-confrontational and welcoming way. So those are the passive things we focus on. It's a great question. Yes.
This is probably involves a complicated answer, but I'm curious about what it takes to restore a wetland.
Oh, that is a good question. So the first thing is to find a really good contractor that knows the value of ecological impact. So wetlands can be done really badly. Wetlands can also be done really well if you factor in the science. So first, you have to really think about your water table, the watersheds. You have to, especially where we're at in central Illinois, you have to think about existing tiles that are already under that structure. Was this a traditional wetland? Does it have that kind of water feature? So you don't want to necessarily, and from our point of view in the conservation world, we don't want to necessarily put a wetland in where it shouldn't be, or it's not going to be sustainable. Some of our wetlands do have a controlled water structure that we can raise and lower for different waterfowl pass-throughs and things like that. But for the most part, our wetlands are those that are in the water, the floodplain. So they're going to be overflow more than anything. But what we have found, honestly, the key is to find that right contractor that has the balance. We've been lucky enough to work with a group called Ecologic. And Ecologic is right across. So where we're at Warbler Ridge, it's just 20 minutes into Indiana, right? We just keep going across the border. But Ecologic is a team of scientists that restore. And that's very different than if you would just call a local contractor who's used to putting in farm ponds and things like that. Nothing, not saying anything, but for our purposes, for conservation purposes, we needed that extra step. And they monitor with us continuously. They come back to the site. They make sure the right things are happening. They also help us create that plant list. That's something that's missed a lot. When you're building wetlands, you have to secure that soil. And not just that, but it has to be ecotype specific to the native flora and fauna of where you're at. So there's so many pieces and parts to that. And so that's how we accomplish that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Quick question. How do you work with the neighboring landowners? Do you have any special database of neighbors?
Cookies. Lots of cookies. We have neighborhood parties where we have our neighbors in and we feed them and we love them. And we try, really, it's about cookies and love and education. That's what we say. We have, in this partnership, as you know, if you have an unwilling landowner next to you and you're removing all the honeysuckle in the world, but they don't believe in that, it's 1 foot, right? So it's really, if you want your efforts to be sustainable, and remember, part of our mission is promote, we have to reach out and do landowner education to our neighbors. And cookies and neighborhood parties are honestly the best way we found to do that. People are extremely hesitant if you just walk up to the door and start prophetizing about native plants, and people often feel even threatened, like, are you from the government? Are you going to take our land? Especially in this community we were in. So it took us years to even build that trust. And so we did it in more of a passive, loving way than coming down or being a judging way. And that may sound like a roundabout answer, but that is the direct truth. That is how we handle that. Now, not everyone will eat the cookies. We do have landowners that still are hesitant or skeptical of our work, or they see it as, we didn't want a nature preserve in our backyard, right? We've all heard those kind of things. And so not everyone loves us. That's just the way it works. But we just keep inviting, and we're not going anywhere. So we just try to be as welcoming as possible. Yes.
Do you allow hunting?
Yes. Yes. Okay, great question.
How do you handle that?
Yes, great question. So Warbler Ridge, now at 1,100 acres by itself, and add 70,000 baby trees to that, it became an issue very fast. So what our first strategy was to build electric fences around the entirety of all those acres, solar-powered electric fences. And we thought we were being really clever. We did this 2-dimensional fence that they told us to try because the deer don't see as well and all of these things. That helped a little. Deer are really smart. And they found ways under and all of the things. We think they had parties at night to discuss their strategy even. But after that, we absolutely, and we had a really bad bout of chronic wasting disease on the property. Anytime you have nature preserves or forest preserves that don't have a hunting mechanism, you usually have what they call sinks, right? Sinks and sources of these populations and disease, right? That's going to happen. So in our year 3, I believe we work with IRAP, which is the Illinois Recreational Access Program. They allow first-time hunters and youth to get a permit, it's archery only, to come out on the property and hunt. That is we enjoy getting new people and new stewards out on the land, but first-time hunters and youth don't take out a lot of deer just by the nature of their skill set. And so there is talk of us increasing our hunting pressure on the site. We have had our heritage biologist talk to us about what we're going to do. But it is a pressure. It is a pressure we feel. What we have started for 2023 is that we are now working with IRAP for a program called the Fallen Outdoors. And it is a wounded veteran program. And they will be coming in for the hunting season of 2023. And so this is the first time we're going to be starting that. Interestingly, when we moved to the Burnett property and we planted the 22,000 baby trees, we got a little smarter. And we just decided to build the biggest 10-foot fence we've ever seen. And we did. And so we surrounded the 60 acres with a 10-foot airport fence, essentially. Again, through mitigation funds. And that seems to be working just fine. So we'll see. But that's a great question.
You mentioned when you first started up this Warbler Ridge complex, you didn't know anybody down there. How did you attract volunteers?
Cookies. And
who did you give the cookies to?
Lots of cookies. So we needed, actually, when I was hired at my first interview, one of the things they said is we need a presence in this community. So your first task is to have us be a known entity, have people trust us, have people get to know us, not just our landowners, but the volunteers that we need. And at the time, there was no master naturalists, there was no assembled conservation groups in that community. So we did everything you'd think. We went to the red, white, and blue days and the parades, and we set up tables, ringing bells for Salvation Army. And we were on the radio, and we were in TV, and we had community events, and we had the scouts out, and they would bring their families. And so we did all of those things. And interestingly enough, it only takes a few really rooted volunteers, as you all know, and then they somehow bring in their friends, and then they bring in their families, and then they bring in their organizations or their workplaces for stewardship days. And so on and on and on. And so right now, and Grand Prairie Friends was instrumental in getting the extension office in Coles to start a Master Naturalist program because we knew that would be a great source for us. And so now we actually even have a volunteer team just for Warbler Ridge. They call themselves the Champions for that exact reason, because they are the champions to champion on new volunteers in this very new community for Grand Prairie Friends. So a lot of them are retired professors from down the street at Eastern Illinois University, botany, ornithologists, master naturalists are very big right now. Kathy's brother-in-law is one of our, there's wherever she went, there you are, is one of our biggest champions. So that's how it happened. Lots of years of pressure, right? We've been there in that community now in year about 6 or 7. So Yeah. Yes. So he asked if we have to buy all those trees, and we had to buy every single one. And that is through the mitigation funds, right? The bats paid for those trees. Now, the bats won't pay for the staff to do the work. The bats didn't pay for the insurance or the gas in our truck or the truck or all of those things, but they did pay for those trees.
One of the questions I have is in terms of invasive species, how do you deal with those and being alert of new ones that may be showing up?
Yeah, it's the battle, right? We all know the battle, the invasive species battle. Honestly, looking at the breadth, 130 miles and 1,200 acres and 2 full-time land staff, one of which is housed and lives on the Warbler Ridge property, because remember, it's 1,100 of the 1,200 by itself. And then our other land manager goes all the way from Ford, Iroquois County on any given day. So we do a lot of triage, which means whatever's yelling the loudest, whichever dumpster fire is on fire the most and causing the biggest threat, that's what we identify. But we depend on our volunteers to then do a lot of that stewardship work at things like Stewardship Saturdays or the Champions. We also have an invasive work day the third Saturday of every month. So our land team will identify and assess and then pass that on to our volunteer coordinator to then get our volunteers. We are seeing things that the very traditional honeysuckle, of course, autumn olive, rubus, which is like the berries, but what we're seeing this year are like lespedeza. So is anyone familiar with? Yes. So some of these are so invasive that we're having to create new ways to work on these. And one of those is a growing season burn. So how many of you have been involved with prescribed fire before? Do prescribed burns? Great. It's a great resource tool. And traditionally, those are after the world goes to sleep, right? After our nature and our animals kind of are going into their hibernation. And so we have prescribed fire usually in the late fall, early spring. But what we're seeing is that we're having to work and do growing season burns. We're actually doing a burn next week, and that's unheard of. That's a newer thing in conservation. It's been happening for a couple of years. There was a big growing season burn in Urbana just last week off the University of Illinois property. And a lot of it is because of this Japanese, what is it? No, is it Japanese knotweed, the lespedeza? I'm trying to think. It's something, bush clover? I think it's Japanese bush. Yes. The problem with it is it's so invasive that they're saying 1 to 2 growing seasons, it will completely choke out the entire ecosystem. And so just south of us at the Ballard Nature Center in Effingham, which is just south of Charleston, just south of our property, they've lost an entire prairie area of about 12, 14 acres to this lespedeza in 2 growing seasons. So that's one of our new ones we're battling.
Anybody else? A question? Okay, Sarah, you have given us lots of places to visit.
I hope you do.
And lots of ideas and thoughts of what we need to do too.
Good,
so
good.
Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you for having me. Thanks so much. Oh, and I did leave maps and brochures back there on the table if you want to locate some of our sites and learn more about Grand Prairie Friends, and also our website, thegrandprairiefriends.org. You can have a tour of all of our sites, and it gives you directions on how to get there and all of those kinds of things.
And Warbler Ridge is very amazing. It's close to my hometown. That's how I became familiar with it. So enjoy refreshments back here, some visiting, look at Sarah's materials. So yes?
I mentioned that next Sunday is a trip to Friends Creek. I suggested that we meet here at 9 o'clock. That probably will, since that's a Sunday, this is probably not the best meeting place. In that case, we could meet over in the parking lot right next door at Jewel Osco toward this corner. I'll be there from, yes. $8:30? Okay, all right. Change that, make it 8:30, and we'll meet right over here in the parking lot by Jewel Osco. And so I'll be there at least for another 10 minutes at least after, between 8:30, 8:40, and we'll get underway. So, okay, thanks.
And then just remember there's some free milkweed, poke milkweed, and some common milkweed. Poke milkweed is part shade milkweed, not as commonly found. Please take some milkweed.